Hello and welcome to the Rook's Nest. It's Alex here, and in this tutorial we're going to be looking at how to create a lighting setup like the one I ripped off here. Now it's a complete copy of a brand film created by the studio Tendril for Microsoft Office 365. If you haven't seen that, you should give it a watch. It's really nice work, so I'll put a link in the description. The idea for this video actually came from a post on Reddit by the Masahiro, I think that's how you pronounce it, asking how to achieve this look using Redshift. So I thought I'd give it a go and share my results with you guys. This isn't a perfect reproduction, and the studio may not have used these techniques exactly, but I think it's pretty close. And after that lengthy intro, let's finally get started. So here we are inside cinema with the scene we're going to be looking at today. It's actually not quite as complicated as it first might seem. It consists of 3 lights, a few environment objects, this base cube and this floor plane, and of course the 4 coloured blocks. Now I'll go over the materials I made towards the end of the video, but first let's focus on making the lighting look nice. So let me just clear out all the relevant stuff in this project and I'll be right back. Right, so here we are all cleared out. And as you can see, the scene is pretty uninspiring at the moment, pretty dull. But the first thing we're going to do is create a dome light. So if we come up to Redshift, lights, and choose dome light, I mean that already looks better, but not exactly what we're after. What we're going to do is we're going to load in a HDRI. Now the HDRI I chose for this is called Artist Workshop, and it's from HDRI Haven, which is a great place. And the reason I chose this was because it looked like the sort of environment that you would expect to find this scene. Because it's sort of in a designer's room and office, and it's also got this large window source, like one light source coming through a window, which is the look we were after. Now at the moment, as you can see, the shadows are going the wrong way. So what I'm going to do is unlock this viewport so we can see a bit better. And just take a look at where this light is coming from. So I'm going to want to rotate this dome light like so until the window is in the right spot. So keep going. There we go. So now if we could check our camera, which I'm going to put a protection tag on because I don't want that to move. So there we go. We're already getting this sort of shadow, but as you can see, it's far too soft. And it's not really what we're after. So what I'm going to add is a physical sun. So once again, we come to Redshift, lights, physical sun. Now this sun, we're going to want coming from the same direction as our window. So if we take a look, let me just lock this frame here. Oh, and leave this camera. At the moment, it's pointing down the Z-axis. So first thing we want to do is rotate it. It's coming in from the direction we want it to. Move it down. We should start to see. Here we go. There we go. So we get those hard shadows in the image. I like to use the world reference rotate as opposed to the actual axis of the object. It makes it easier to sort of shift it exactly the way you want it to. There we go. Now that's obviously far too intense at the moment. So let's come down to our saturation as well. So we're going to get rid of we don't want it really to cast any colour over our scene. So we'll get rid of that. We also want to reduce the intensity because it's far too bright. Bring it down. There we go. And also, I'm not really liking the way that it's affecting the specular. So I'm just going to turn down the glossiness. Scale for this light. There we go. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to create an area light. Now this area light, so we go to Redshift, lights, area light. The purpose of this area light is just to focus on our blocks, not necessarily the whole scene. So if I rotate it, let's put it sort of coming from the same direction as our sunlight and our HDRI. Move it back, move it up. It still isn't, but this is obviously incredibly too. Now it's easier if this is not on world axis rotate. This is obviously way too bright and way too big at the minute. So let's just bring the size down. I mean, the purpose is just to give you more visual interest on the reflections on the material. But what we're going to do is we don't want it to affect the rest of the scene because it's far too. It just ruins it. So we're going to go to Project and go to Include, and we're only going to include our colored blocks. We're also going to reduce this intensity of this light quite drastically. Now we're getting far too much reflections in the top here with this. So I'm going to bring it down. There we go. So we're getting a bit on the edge here and affecting this top corner. Now, also, this is quite a hot spot here. And if we move our dome light, just rotate this around and see where that's coming from. Yeah, so the culprit is our physical sun, the world axis. See, it's causing that big, hot, bright light. And again, I don't really want that to happen. I'm going to go back to Ray, and we're just going to drop this down even further until it's almost invisible. Okay, so now we've got a basic setup for our lighting. Now we need to introduce those shadows that you see that cast across the image. And to do that, I'm just going to create some simple geometry. First thing I'm going to do is create a plane object. So come up here, select plane. We don't need that large. Let's make it 100 by 100. Oh, there's another quick thing to note, the scale of the scene. So as you can see, this is only 50 centimeters wide. Because I thought if it was on a desk, that's probably how large it would be. And the reason we do that, you know, the smaller your object, the softer shadows, the larger your object, the harder. So if you've got a shadow on a building, you'll notice it's dead sharp. Whereas if you've got shadows on something small on the ground outside, it'll have blurry shadow. So it's just a thing to keep in mind, the scale of the scene. Anyway, with this plane, we're just going to give it 2 width segments and 2 height segments. And then we're going to place it in a, atom array, like so. We've got this, and we're going to make this frame a lot thinner. So we're just making a window frame, really. And in fact, I want 3 segments. And as a moment, they're still a bit too thick. So let's make them nice and thin, 0.5 and 0.5. And let's make this easier on ourselves. Let's give this, instead of on the Y orientation, let's try it on the Z. What we're going to do is we're just going to move this window up back here. And we're just going to put it where we think it looks best, really, for the shadows cast. Actually, the shadows are a bit harsh at the minute. We're going to sort that out in a second. Push it back a bit. You can see you don't want it too close. Might make it thinner. So we can just adjust the width of the plane. Put it across. A bit thicker. There we go. Just leave it like that for now. We'll adjust it later. Now the next thing we want is, it's almost like there was a wall here casting a shadow over this edge. So just going to grab a cube, squash it down. Actually, let's squash it this way and push it back it over here. Make that line up. There we go, we've got a wall. I mean, we're getting closer and closer. Let's make these shadows softer. So we come up to physical sun. What we're going to do is we're going to adjust this sun disk scale. You see, as we increase this value, our shadows get softer. And as we decrease them, you know, they get sharper. So we just need to find a decent spot. It looks, I think around 2, 2.5. But this is really up to, this is your discretion really, how you like it. The other thing we can do is duplicate our physical sun. Duplicate our physical sun and adjust the scale on this. And maybe reduce the intensity of our main sun. It's probably best if we're in bucket mode to see this. And I'll just select the region over here. Because essentially you're then casting two shadows. And you can get a sort of, you see how you've got one shadow that's thicker there, and then the more, a second line, which is really faint in this. But just for simplicity now, let's just stick with one for the time being. Right, now the scene is still too dark. So I'm going to go to my dome light, and I'm just going to increase the exposure of this HDRI to bring up the ambient brightness of the scene. Now, we don't want it too bright. I think I'm going to rotate this physical sun because I want this shadow, I think, to lean over a bit more. Or I could just rotate this and bring it closer. But I think it's fine actually where it is. Let's have a play with our physical sun. See if we can get, there we go. I mean, I think that's a nicer angle. You can turn off the shadows for your dome light, but it just ruins, it just ruins the image. You are getting a bit of doubling up with shadows, but as long as your position of your light source and your HDRI is pretty much the same as your physical sun, you should be okay. Right, let's tweak these lights a bit more just to get a nice result. So first thing, let's get back to this dome light. General, and let's increase the exposure. Let's go to 1.2. There we go, much nicer. And let's check the shadows. I think I want them a slightly softer. So let's just put this up to 3. There we go, and that's looking better already. This area light, what's our intensity? Oh, here, 3, 4. So all this stuff depends on your materials as well. So like some you might need higher values, some need lower values, depending on their color. So just keep that in mind whilst you're lighting your scene. Let me just show you quickly what my render settings are as well for this. Let me just go to bucket rendering, settings, Redshift. I think at the moment I've got the experimental, automatic sampling on, but we'll turn that off. I'm using brute force GI and irradiance point cloud. Brute force is just at 128 samples, and I just set the default screen radius to 16. My sampling overrides pretty low. Reflections at 512, refractions at 256, ambient occlusion 256, and my light is at 1024. And then my samples max on the unified is 256 and minimum 8. Obviously you can back these up. I guess the most important thing is the GI. Just make sure you're using, if you're going to animate, make sure you're using brute force and irradiance point cloud. If you're creating a still, it's totally fine to use the irradiance cache. But for animation, you're going to be wanting to use brute force. Our camera settings are also quite important. I'm actually using a focal length of 135. Let me just pause this while it renders out. So normally the smaller your object is, the longer you want your focal length to be for your camera. It also gives it this perspective. If we change it to, let's say, a classic 36mm. First of all, not only are we really far away, but you can see how the perspective on the object is slightly different. But if we're nice and tight on this telly, you see it flattens out the image, or straightens the edges. I just realised, well, I think I need to remove the glossiness completely from this physical sun. So I'm just going to put it down to 0. It was causing too much, picking up on the material, causing too much unwanted smudges. I'm also going to increase the intensity of this sun, just to brighten the scene up. Some more. There we go, now we're starting to get even closer. All that's left to do now is to add those plants. All that's left to do now is to add some extra visual interest in the shadow. And the way we're going to be doing that is by importing a few stock free OBJs of plants. So if we come here, I found these on TurboSquid. I probably should have used the content browser in Cinema 4D, but I didn't have it installed. So I just downloaded this model here, so which I'm going to open now, which I'll merge into the project. OBJ, hibiscus. Okay. If that's load in. There we go, and it's huge. But what we're going to do is we're just going to scale the whole thing down to a realistic size. And I'm just going to move the objects back here. Rotate them around. As you can see, they're already casting shadows. Could probably go individual. Oh, we don't even need these plant plot bases. Just move some of these. That's quite nice. That's quite nice. And then do the same with this thing. Drop it down a bit. Maybe slide it over to the side. Bring it up. There we go. So as you can see, we're still not quite right. It's still a bit dark and dingy around here in the shadows. And I think that's because I need to rotate my dome light a bit more. So if we just come out and have a look, because there's 2 windows here. If I just rotate my dome light like so, and use this window, then this window is also lighting up here a bit more. We come back in now. There we go, we've got a much nicer result. So that's it really, it's just 3 lights. A dome light with a HDRI that looks like the environment you want it to be in. A physical sun for the harsh shadows. Then an area light just to boost the areas you feel need a bit more oomph. And then just some basic models to add some visual interest into the shadows. Now let's just take a quick look at the materials for those that are interested. This tutorial's already gone on way longer than I expected. So all the textures in this scene are pretty much identical. All I've gone and done is just alter the color slightly for each one. So they're just variations of the same texture. So I'll just go through this dark blue, which is the one I started with. And that should explain how all the others work. And these are just recolors of this dark blue texture or material. So if I open it up to take a look. Now it's just a standard glossy material with some roughness, which is driven by a noise, maximum noise, which I'll show you in a minute, with a bit of refraction, not too much, and some subsurface scattering, but in the absorption, not the scatter, because I just wanted it to be let light through but absorb not all of it. That makes sense. Most materials work like this in the real world, so it kind of adds a bit to the realism. If you can see, if I turn this up all the way, you can see the lights coming through, but we don't. I just wanted it to come through slightly. I'll just put it onto 0.2. Now, I think that's the only... Yeah, I've got no coating or anything else. There's no bump maps or anything. The only thing really about it that makes it slightly more interesting is the roughness, the reflective roughness, which I've driven by these two noises. The first one's this epoxo noise. I'll show you what it looks like this, where I've just modified the scale, reduced the scale a bit, with just the brightness and contrast. It's not there to, it's basically in the image, I'm trying to give it the look of water residue, or sort of like a coating of grime. So I combined that with this displaced turbulence in a color layer where I just in lighten mode, and if you have a look at the combination of those two, it just gives us this sort of murky pattern thing that kind of looks a bit like if you were to dry water on something, what it would leave behind. It's not great, but it's adding these small imperfections which sell the realism of the scene. Yeah, and then that's just on the surface. Yeah, and that's that. And then these are just recolors of the same thing. Oh, the reason why as well this looks glossy here is because this is my setup for the MoGraph for the animation, where it animates transitions from one material to the other using a color user data node. Which, if anyone's interested in how I animated that loop at the start of this tutorial, let me know in the comments, because if enough people are interested, I'll make a tutorial on that quickly. It didn't take long, it's pretty short. But yeah, there we go, that's the materials. Well done for making it this far. If you like the video, please subscribe, leave a comment, especially if you have any questions or suggestions for future tutorials. All the links to any assets used will be in the description below, along with our Patreon, where you can download the project files for this final animation. It's been a pleasure, thanks for watching.